The day Eleanor Ashford arrived in Timber Ridge, Washington Territory, 3 wealthy merchants made a bet about which of them would marry her first. But none of them expected the silent mountain giant to steal her heart with nothing more than a single act of mercy. It was late September 1889 when the stagecoach rattled up the muddy mountain road, pine trees towering like cathedral columns on either side. Eleanor pressed her gloved hand against the fogged window, watching civilization fade into wilderness with each lurching mile. Behind her, in Boston, lay the ruins of everything she'd known. Her father's disgraced shipping company, the cancelled engagement to a man who vanished the moment the money did, and the pitying glances of society matrons who once begged for invitations to her family's balls. Ahead in this remote logging town waited the unknown, a teaching position secured through desperate letters and the charity of a distant cousin she'd never met. The coach crested a final rise, and Timber Ridge sprawled below. It was hardly a town at all, more a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the mountainside like barnacles to a ship's hull. Smoke rose from a massive lumber mill near the river, and beyond it the forest stretched endlessly, dark and impenetrable. Eleanor's stomach tightened. This was as far from the cobblestone streets and gaslights of Boston as she could imagine. When the coach jolted to a stop outside the general store, a small crowd had gathered. Women in simple calico dresses whispered behind their hands. Men in wool shirts and suspenders stared openly, their faces weathered by wind and sun. Eleanor stepped down carefully, her traveling dress of dove-grey silk instantly marking her as an outsider. The mud sucked at her leather boots. "You must be Miss Ashford." A thin woman with severely pinned hair approached, her expression as warm as the November winds that would soon descend from the peaks. "I'm Mrs. Harriet Bledsoe. My husband owns the mill. Your cousin Martha wrote to say you'd be arriving." "Thank you for meeting me," Eleanor said, summoning the composure her mother had drilled into her since childhood. "I'm eager to begin teaching." Mrs. Bledsoe's lips thinned. "Yes, well, we'll see about that. The schoolhouse is rudimentary, Miss Ashford. The children here aren't like Boston children. They're rough, half wild, some of them." Before Eleanor could respond, a man in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd. He was handsome in a practiced way, his mustache waxed to sharp points, his boots polished despite the mud. "Franklin Pritchard," he announced, removing his hat with a flourish. "I own the land office and several timber claims." "Welcome to Timber Ridge, Miss Ashford. A lady of your refinement is a rare treasure in these mountains." Another man appeared at Pritchard's elbow, younger, with slicked-back hair and calculating eyes. "Charles Waverley, at your service. I manage the lumber mill accounts." He smiled, revealing 2 white teeth. "I do hope you'll allow me to show you around town, what little there is of it." A third man, older and greying, introduced himself as Judge Cornelius Thorne. "My late wife was cultured like yourself, Miss Ashford. Perhaps you might join me for dinner this week. I have a piano that hasn't been played since she passed." Eleanor murmured polite responses, overwhelmed by the attention. In Boston, she'd been desirable for her father's fortune. Here, apparently, she was valuable simply for being educated and female. The realization was both flattering and unsettling. "The wagon for your trunks will be along shortly, Mrs. Bledsoe said, already steering Eleanor away from the men. "You'll board with the Hendersons. They have a spare room since their eldest married. It's not what you're accustomed to, I'm sure, but it's clean." As they walked up the rutted main street, Eleanor noticed a massive building set apart from the others, a long structure built of enormous logs with smoke rising from multiple chimneys. Men moved in and out, carrying tools and equipment. "What is that?" she asked. "That's the camp office and main supply depot," Mrs. Bledsoe said dismissively. "The logging crews come down from the mountain camps to collect provisions. You'll want to avoid that area, Miss Ashford. Lumberjacks are uncouth." Eleanor said nothing, but her gaze lingered on the building. A group of men emerged, their shoulders impossibly broad, their movements efficient and powerful. They were different from the town men, harder somehow, as though carved from the same timber they felled. That evening, settled into the Hendersons' spare bedroom with its simple iron bed and faded quilt, Eleanor wrote in her journal by candlelight. The house was small but spotlessly clean, and Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman with flour permanently dusted in her apron creases, had served a hearty dinner of venison stew and fresh bread. Mr. Henderson, a barrel maker, had said little, but his eyes were not unkind. Through the thin walls, Eleanor could hear the sounds of Timber Ridge settling into night, distant laughter from the saloon, the lowing of cattle, the constant whisper of wind through pines. So different from the clip-clop of carriages and the gas-lamp glow of Commonwealth Avenue. She thought of her mother, who died 3 years before and been spared witnessing the family's disgrace. Perhaps she would have approved of this, Eleanor making her own way, using her education for purpose rather than ornament. The schoolhouse awaited her in the morning. 30 children, Mrs. Bledsoe had said, ranging from age 5 to 15. Many had never had a proper teacher. The previous instructor, a young man from Seattle, had lasted only 2 months before fleeing back to civilization, defeated by the isolation and the students' resistance to learning. Eleanor extinguished the candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the mountain wind. Somewhere out there, in camps perched on steep slopes, men were felling trees that had stood for centuries. The thought filled her with a strange mixture of melancholy and awe. She did not yet know that one of those men, a figure more legend than human in these parts, had already heard of her arrival. Did not know that he'd stood at the edge of town that afternoon, watching from the shadow of the pines as she descended from the coach. Did not know that he'd seen something in the way she lifted her chin against the stairs, in the proud set of her shoulders, despite the obvious fear in her eyes. His name was Magnus Thorne, though most called him the Mountain Giant. At 6 feet 7 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle was long, he was the most successful independent logger in Washington Territory. He owned 3 timber claims outright, employed 50 men, and possessed a fortune that would dwarf the combined wealth of every merchant in Timber Ridge, though few in town knew it. He lived alone in a cabin high on the mountain, descended only for supplies, and spoke so rarely that many believed he was mute. He was Judge Thorne's nephew, though the 2 men barely acknowledged each other. There was bad blood there, stretching back to a tragedy no one discussed. Magnus had not intended to notice the new schoolteacher, had not intended to watch her at all. But something about the way the afternoon light caught her dark hair, about the way she held herself like a queen even as her world crumbled around her, it had made him pause, made him remember what it felt like to hope for something beyond the next tree, the next cut, the next season's profit. He'd turned away quickly, disturbed by his own reaction, and disappeared back into the forest. He had timber to cut and men to oversee. He had no business thinking about a refined city woman who would never survive her first winter in these mountains, let alone look twice at a rough-hewn man who smelled of pine sap and sweat. But as he climbed the darkening trail to his camp that night, Magnus Thorne could not quite shake the image of Eleanor Ashford's face from his mind, or the strange, unwelcome ache that had settled in his chest when Franklin Pritchard took her hand and smiled. The mountain wind sang through the trees, and far below, in her narrow bed, Eleanor Ashford slept fitfully, dreaming of forests that went on forever. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town like an afterthought, a single room of rough-hewn planks, with gaps wide enough to let in the October wind. Eleanor arrived at dawn on her first morning, determined to prepare the space before the children came. Inside she found chaos, overturned benches, a pot-bellied stove thick with rust, and textbooks so damaged by moisture they'd swollen into useless lumps. She rolled up her sleeves and set to work. By the time the first students arrived, she'd swept the floor, arranged the salvageable benches into rows and written the alphabet in neat chalk letters across the slate board she'd scrubbed clean. Her hands were raw and her dress dusty, but the room looked like a place of learning. The children came in suspicious clusters, boys in patched wool trousers, girls in faded dresses too short at the ankles. They ranged from tiny 5-year-olds to hulking 15-year-old boys, nearly as tall as Eleanor herself. They stared at her fine dress, her carefully pinned hair, her Boston accent. She could feel their skepticism like a physical weight. "Good morning," she said calmly. "I'm Miss Ashford. Please find a seat." A lanky boy near the back snorted. "We ain't got to listen to you. Last teacher couldn't make us do nothing." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "The last teacher isn't here. I am." "What's your name?" "Tom Waverley." He leaned back, arms crossed. My pa says you're just playing at being a teacher till you find a husband. Several children giggled. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. Your father is entitled to his opinion. However, in this schoolhouse, I'm the teacher and you're the student. Now can you read? Tom's smirk faltered. Some. Then you'll practice every day until you can read anything put in front of you. Reading is power, Tom. It means no one can cheat you or lie to you about what's written in a contract. She turned to address the whole class. That goes for all of you. I don't care if you think you'll spend your whole life in these mountains. You deserve to understand the world beyond them. The room had gone quiet. A small girl in the front row raised her hand tentatively. Miss, can you teach us about cities? I ain't never seen one. Eleanor smiled. Yes, Sarah, we'll learn about many places. But first let's see where everyone is with their letters. The morning revealed the extent of the challenge. Half the children could barely write their names. Most had never held a proper pencil. Mathematical knowledge was nearly non-existent beyond basic counting. But Eleanor also discovered fierce intelligence in unexpected places. A quiet boy named James, who could calculate board feet in his head because he helped his father at the mill. A girl named Lucy, who'd memorized entire passages from the Bible despite never being taught to read. By noon, when the children scattered home for lunch, Eleanor was exhausted but exhilarated. This was real teaching. Not the ornamental French and watercolors she'd learned at finishing school, but education that could change lives. She was heating water for tea on the temperamental stove when the door opened. Mrs. Bledsoe entered with another woman, sharp-featured and elegantly dressed by Timber Ridge standards. Miss Ashford, this is Mrs. Cordelia Thorne, the judge's sister-in-law. The woman's gaze swept the cleaned schoolhouse with obvious disapproval. I've come to observe your methods, Miss Ashford. The school board must ensure standards are maintained. Eleanor recognized a test when she saw one. Of course. The afternoon pupils will arrive shortly. You're welcome to stay. Mrs. Thorne settled onto a back bench, like a judge at a trial. When the children returned, she watched with hawkish intensity as Eleanor led them through arithmetic, geography, and reading exercises. Tom Waverley tested her repeatedly, slouching, talking out of turn, accidentally knocking his slate to the floor. Eleanor corrected him firmly but without anger, refusing to be baited. The breakthrough came with the older girls. Eleanor had brought her own books from Boston, including a volume of poetry. When she read Longfellow aloud, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere," even the most skeptical students leaned forward, caught in the rhythm of the words. "That's about the Revolution?" asked Lucy, eyes wide. "It is. About ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they believed in something larger than themselves." "Like the loggers," piped up a small boy. "My pa says they're building America, one tree at a time." Eleanor smiled. Exactly like that. When school ended, Mrs. Thorne approached with an expression that might have been approval. "You have a firm hand, Miss Ashford. That's necessary here. Though I question the value of filling these children's heads with poetry when most will never leave this mountain." "With respect, Mrs. Thorne, that's precisely why poetry matters," Eleanor said quietly. "It reminds them there's beauty in the world, even when life is hard." The woman's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more, sweeping out in a rustle of skirts. That evening, Eleanor stopped at the general store for lamp oil. Franklin Pritchard materialized at her elbow, all smooth concern. "I hear you had quite a day at the school, Miss Ashford. Tom Waverley can be a handful. If you need someone to have a word with his father—" "Thank you, Mr. Pritchard, but that won't be necessary. Tom and I have reached an understanding. But a lady shouldn't have to discipline rough boys alone." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, Charles Waverley spoils that boy rotten, throws money at him instead of teaching respect. Not that Charles lacks for funds. He's skimming from the mill accounts, I'd wager. Not that I could prove it." Eleanor felt a flash of distaste. In Boston, she'd known many men like Pritchard, quick to spread gossip under the guise of friendly concern. "I really must be going, Mrs. Henderson is expecting me for supper." Of course, but Miss Ashford, I do hope you'll consider my dinner invitation, Saturday perhaps. My cook makes an excellent roast." She offered a non-committal smile and fled. Walking back through the dusky streets, Eleanor passed the supply depot she'd noticed her first day. The yard was busy with men loading wagons for the mountain camps. She slowed, curious despite herself, watching them hoist barrels and crates that must have weighed hundreds of pounds. And then she saw him. He stood apart from the others, checking items against a list. He was easily the largest man Eleanor had ever seen, not just tall but built on a different scale entirely, as though God had used twice the usual amount of clay. His shoulders strained against a wool shirt, his hands dwarfing the pencil he held. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and his dark hair was pulled back with a leather cord. He moved with surprising grace for someone so massive, his attention focused entirely on his task. "That's Magnus Thorne," said a voice behind her. Eleanor jumped. A young woman about her own age stood there, carrying a basket of eggs. The mountain giant, they call him. He's the judge's nephew, though they don't speak. Owns more land than anyone, but lives like a hermit up on Raven Peak. "He's a logger?" Eleanor asked, unable to look away. "The best there is, fair to his men, they say, and strong as 10 ordinary fellows. But strange, barely talks. Some think he's touched in the head, but my husband works for him and says he's sharp as a tack. Just doesn't waste words." The woman smiled. "I'm Mary Chen. My husband James works Magnus's saw crew." "Eleanor Ashford. I'm the new teacher." "I know. Everyone knows." Mary's smile widened. "Whole town's been talking about nothing else. 3 suitors already, and you've been here less than a week. That must be some kind of record." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I'm not looking for a husband. I came here to teach." Tell that to Pritchard and Waverley and the judge. They're practically drawing up battle lines." Mary glanced toward the depot. "Of course, if you're smart, you'll set your cap for Magnus. He's worth 10 of them put together, and I don't just mean in coin. I don't even know the man. Nobody does, really. But James says he's decent. That's rare enough in these parts." As if sensing their attention, Magnus Thorne looked up. His gaze found Eleanor across the yard, and held. Even from this distance, she felt the impact of it. His eyes were dark and unreadable, his expression giving nothing away. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then he turned deliberately away, hoisting a barrel onto his shoulder as though it weighed nothing, and disappeared into the depot building. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "He's rather intimidating." Mary laughed. "That he is. But I've never heard of him harming anything except trees. Can't say the same for some of the others courting you." They parted ways, and Eleanor continued home, but her thoughts kept circling back to the man in the depot yard, the mountain giant, Magnus Thorne. There had been something in that brief moment of eye contact, a spark of recognition perhaps, or simply curiosity. She shook her head firmly. She had a job to focus on, children to teach. Romance, if it came at all, would be a distant consideration. She'd learned that lesson painfully in Boston. Promises meant little, and the affections of men even less. Better to focus on what she could control, lessons and books, and making a difference in these children's lives. But that night, lying in bed with the mountain wind howling outside, Eleanor couldn't quite shake the image of dark eyes meeting hers across a crowded yard, or the strange flutter it had caused in her chest. The first real test came with the fever. By late October, the mountain air had turned sharp, the mornings edged with frost that glittered on the rooftops like a thin layer of glass. Helena rose each day in darkness, lit the schoolhouse stove with numb fingers, and fought smoke and stubborn kindling until the room was warm enough for small hands and thin coats. The children arrived with red cheeks and runny noses, tracking mud and pine needles across the floor, bringing with them the smells of wood smoke, wet wool, and the forest itself. She was beginning to learn their rhythms. James, the quiet boy good with numbers, liked to arrive early and stack kindling. Lucy read faster than Eleanor could supply books. Sarah, who had asked about cities, drew elaborate pictures of streets and tall buildings whenever she could steal a scrap of paper. Even Tom Waverley, her most defiant student, had begun to sit straighter when she called on him, as if some small part of him cared what she thought. Then one Monday Sarah didn't come. Eleanor noticed her absence right away. The small girl's usual place on the front bench felt like a missing tooth in a smile. When the morning bell rang and Sarah still hadn't arrived, Eleanor asked the class, "Has anyone seen Sarah today?" A boy in the second row raised his hand. "Ma says she's sick, miss." "Real bad." Pa took the horse and went for the doctor in Creston, but that's near a day's ride, what with the mud. The Hendersons had no telephone, and neither did most of Timber Ridge. News travelled by word of mouth, carried along the same paths as the logging wagons and the river water. Eleanor dismissed the class early that afternoon, her mind already made up. She could not sit by while one of her pupils lay ill and helpless. "Where do the Barnetts live?" she asked the boy who'd spoken. "About 2 miles up the eastern trail," he said. "Stream's on the right, little cabin with a broken shutter. But Ma says it ain't proper for a lady to go up alone." "It's not proper to let a child suffer alone either," Eleanor said, already shrugging into her cloak. The trail was steeper than she'd expected, the mud sucking at her boots, the wind cutting through her wool cloak like knives. The forest loomed close, branches creaking overhead, the scent of damp earth and old pine needles filling her lungs. She stumbled more than once, catching herself on trunks slick with moss, her skirts heavy with muddy water. By the time she saw the Barnetts' cabin, leaning slightly, one shutter indeed hanging by a single hinge, her calves burned and her breath came in white puffs. Inside, the air was thick and sour with sickness. Sarah lay on a narrow pallet, her small body flushed and trembling, sweat soaking her hair. Her mother knelt beside her, eyes wild with fear and lack of sleep. "Who? Oh, you're the teacher. Eleanor Ashford," she said, dropping her cloak. "I came as soon as I heard. Has the doctor arrived?" Mrs. Barnett shook her head. "Ned rode out last night. Road's bad. Might be tomorrow before they're back. She keeps burning up, then shaking cold. I don't know what to do." Eleanor had seen fever before, in Boston tenements where her church had sent visiting ladies with bowls of soup and Bibles. She'd watched a nurse lower a boy into a tepid bath to draw the heat from his skin, had listened as the woman explained the balance of warmth and cool, of fluids and rest. She'd paid attention, even when others turned away, and now those remembered instructions rose in her mind like lifelines. "Do you have a tub? Extra linens?" Eleanor asked. "Aye, but what good? We need to lower her temperature and keep her drinking. I'll help you." For hours they worked. They heated water, then cooled it with snow Eleanor scraped from the shadowed side of the cabin. They sponged Sarah's skin, changed her damp shift, coaxed small sips of water and thin broth between clenched teeth. Eleanor ignored the ache in her arms, the damp seeping into her own clothes. She spoke softly to Sarah of cities and stories, of a world beyond the small hot room. "Remember Paul Revere," she murmured when the girl whimpered. "How he rode through the night to warn his people. You're like that, Sarah. Brave in the dark. You keep riding, all right? Don't you stop now." "Mrs." Barnett watched her with something like awe. "Why are you doing this?" she asked hoarsely at one point, wringing out a cloth. "You don't even know us." "You trusted me with your daughter in my classroom," Eleanor said simply. "How could I not be here now, when she needs someone most?" Outside the light faded. Wind rattled the broken shutter. Hours blurred into a haze of motion and murmured prayers. Eleanor's back throbbed, her eyes burned, but she refused to rest until Sarah's fever broke or the doctor arrived. It was near midnight when the door crashed open. A gust of cold air swept in along with the towering figure of a man. For a moment, framed in the doorway, he seemed part of the storm itself. Then he stepped inside, ducking his head slightly, and Eleanor's breath caught. Magnus Thorne. He looked even larger in the cramped cabin than he had in the depot yard. So tall he nearly brushed the rafters, his shoulders broad enough to block the door. Snow clung to his boots and dark hair, melting in droplets that glistened in his beard. His eyes, deep-set and intense, flicked from Sarah's flushed face to Eleanor's exhausted one, then to Mrs. Barnett, who sprang to her feet. "Mr. Thorne," she gasped. "We weren't expecting—" "James told me," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Said the teacher came up alone." His gaze shifted back to Eleanor. "Road's washed out, doctor's wagon couldn't make the pass. He's stuck half a day's ride away." Eleanor's stomach lurched. "Then it's us or nothing." Magnus stepped closer to the pallet, his movements surprisingly careful for a man his size. He laid a calloused hand against Sarah's forehead, his brow furrowing. "She's hot as a kiln, but she's breathing clear. No rattle. You know about fevers? Eleanor asked, startled. Seen enough of them, he replied shortly. Lost men to lung fever in winter camps, others pulled through. You've been cooling her? Yes, as best we can. He nodded once. You're on the right course. She needs rest and watching. He looked at Mrs. Barnett. You should sleep. I'll help the teacher sit with her. Mrs. Barnett hesitated. I couldn't ask you. You didn't. He shifted a rickety chair closer to the pallet. Go on. You'll be no use if you drop. The woman looked from him to Eleanor, then to her daughter. At last exhaustion won. Wake me if she worsens, she whispered, and stumbled to the corner pallet she shared with her husband. Silence settled, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Sarah's soft, feverish murmurs. Eleanor dipped a cloth into the basin, wrung it out, and laid it on the girl's forehead. Magnus watched, his expression unreadable. You did well, he said quietly after a time. Coming up here. I couldn't ignore it, she answered, equally soft. She's my student. Most in town would have said a prayer and gone about their business. I'm not most in town. The words came out sharper than she intended. Weariness frayed her control. Forgive me. I'm tired. Something like the ghost of a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. You're allowed. He leaned back, the chair creaking in protest. You aren't from here. No. She glanced at him. In the dim lamplight, his features seemed carved from shadow and stone. Boston. That far? He nodded slowly. What made you leave? When she hesitated, he added, Tell me to mind my own business if you like. I won't be offended. It's not a simple answer, she admitted. But the short version is that my father lost everything. My fiancée disappeared, and society decided I was no longer worth inviting to dinner. Teaching was the only respectable employment I could find. A distant cousin wrote of an opening here, so I came. He studied her, as if weighing her words. Hard thing, he said at last. Falling from a height. She gave a humorless little laugh. You speak as if you know. His gaze drifted to the small, grimy window where the storm pressed against the glass. My family had expectations. Different kind of height. Same fall. They wanted a lawyer. A judge, like my uncle. I wanted the trees. He shrugged, the motion making his shirt strain across his shoulders. We reached an understanding. I left, took what was mine, built my own camp. Haven't sat at my uncle's table in 10 years. Eleanor absorbed this in silence, surprised by how much he'd shared. For a man everyone called a hermit, he spoke when it mattered. She found that she wanted to know more. And you never regretted it. Choosing the forest over their plans? His eyes returned to her face, searching. Regrets are like stumps after a clear cut. You work around them or you trip and break your neck. The faint almost smile again. Some days I curse the cold, the danger, the loneliness. But when I stand on a ridge at dawn and look out over those trees, knowing I've built something with my own hands, no, I don't regret it. His words resonated more deeply than he could know. Eleanor looked down at Sarah, at the small, sweat-slick hand she held. I know that feeling, she murmured. Of building something new out of ruins. They fell into an odd companionship then, the kind born of shared watchfulness. They took turns changing cloths, coaxing sips of water, listening to Sarah's breathing. Occasionally a log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. Once, far outside, a wolf howled, answered by another on a distant ridge. Near dawn, after hours of this careful vigil, Eleanor felt heat fade beneath her hand. She touched Sarah's forehead again, heart quickening. She's cooler. Magnus leaned in, his large hand overlapping hers for a moment as they both checked. His skin was rough and warm, dwarfing her gloved fingers. The contact sent a small, inexplicable jolt through her, as if a live current had passed between them. He withdrew quickly, but not before his eyes flicked to hers, a question there he didn't voice. You're right, he said. Fever's breaking. She's past the worst. Relief flooded Eleanor so fiercely she had to close her eyes. Her body sagged, the exhaustion of the last 24 hours crashing over her. Thank God. Thank you, he corrected quietly. You got here in time. Did the right things. Doctor likely would have done no better. She's strong, Eleanor said, opening her eyes again. She just needed help fighting. You gave it. He studied her again, more openly this time. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? A society girl sent to play at teaching until a rich husband took her away. His bluntness might have stung if not for the fact that others in town had clearly thought the same. Soft hands, soft heart. And what do you think now? She asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. He tipped his head slightly, considering. Your hands aren't soft anymore, he said at last, and your heart's stronger than half the men I know. Heat bloomed in her cheeks, unrelated to the stuffy cabin air. That's kind of you. It's the truth. He rose, stretching cramped muscles, and the room seemed to shrink again around him. I'll send James up with supplies later. You should rest when you can. You're leaving? Camp needs me. Men to organize, trees to mark. Can't be in two places at once. He paused at the door, looking back at her. But if you ever have need on the mountain roads, send word. My men know how to find me. And then he was gone, swallowed by the pale light of dawn and the swirling snow beyond the threshold. When Ned Barnett and the delayed doctor finally arrived that afternoon, they found Sarah sleeping peacefully, her fever broken, her mother and the schoolteacher dozing upright beside her pallet. Word spread quickly through Timber Ridge. The city girl had hiked alone into the woods to tend a sick child and stayed all night. By the end of the day, the story had grown in the telling. She'd fought off wolves. She'd personally summoned the mountain giant from his ridge. She'd performed miracles with nothing but water and will. Eleanor heard the whispers when she returned to town, cheeks wind-burned, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. Mrs. Henderson clucked over her like a broody hen. Mary Chen hugged her so fiercely she nearly lost her breath. Even Mrs. Thorne, passing on the boardwalk, gave her a curt nod that might have been respect. Only Franklin Pritchard looked displeased. He cornered her outside the general store that evening, his expression tight. You mustn't put yourself in such danger, Miss Ashford, he scolded. Imagine if you'd become lost or ill yourself. The town cannot afford to lose its only teacher. The Barnetts couldn't afford to lose their daughter either, she replied evenly. I did what was necessary. He frowned. Compassion is admirable in a lady, but so is prudence. There are men better suited to such tasks. His lip curled slightly. Lumberjacks, for instance. Eleanor thought of Magnus's steady hands, his calm assessments, the way he'd shared the vigil without complaint. Some men, perhaps, she said, but they weren't there. I was. Pritchard studied her, something calculating in his gaze. You're becoming quite the heroine in their eyes, he said slowly. The people do love a story. Just take care, Miss Ashford. Favor can turn as quickly as mountain weather. One misstep and admiration becomes condemnation. His tone sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the October air. For the first time since arriving in Timber Ridge, she saw clearly the shape of a different kind of danger. Not the obvious peril of storms and sickness, but the quieter, insidious threat of resentment and gossip. As she walked home under a sky streaked with the last gold of sunset, Eleanor couldn't help glancing toward the dark line of the mountain. Somewhere up there, Magnus Thorne was already at work, felling giants of another kind. He had seen her at her most exhausted and had called her strong. The knowledge warmed her more than the cloak around her shoulders. The title moment arrives here, the first time Magnus publicly, unmistakably takes her side. November brought rain in earnest. It came in long, relentless sheets that turned the roads to treacle and blurred the line between sky and mountain. The river swelled, churning with uprooted branches and flecks of foam. The town of Timber Ridge huddled closer to its stoves and lamps, the outside world shrinking to the radius of one's umbrella or oilskin coat. At the schoolhouse, leaks multiplied like unwelcome guests. Eleanor arrived each morning to find new drips, new dark blooms on the ceiling. She commandeered buckets and pots, rearranged benches, and taught arithmetic to the rhythm of falling water. The children accepted it, as they accepted everything the mountain threw at them, with shrugs and practical adjustments. One particularly sodden afternoon, as she dismissed class, Mrs. Bledsoe arrived at the door with an expression of strained politeness. Miss Ashford, the school board is convening this evening at the church hall. We would like your attendance. Of course, Eleanor said, though a knot formed in her stomach. Invitations phrased like that rarely preceded good news. After supper at the Hendersons, she walked to the church hall under a sky the color of old iron. Lanterns glowed in the windows, casting yellow squares onto the slick boardwalk. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and beeswax. The school board, Judge Thorne, Mrs. Thorne, Mrs. Bledsoe, Franklin Pritchard, and Charles Waverley, sat behind a long table. A handful of townspeople occupied the benches. Parents, mill workers, Mary and her husband James, Mrs. Henderson. Eleanor took a seat near the front, coat still damp from the walk. She folded her hands in her lap and raised her chin, determined not to show nerves. Judge Thorne cleared his throat. "Miss Ashford, thank you for coming. We have some concerns regarding your methods." "My methods?" she repeated. Mrs. Bledsoe spoke, twisting a handkerchief between her hands. "It has come to our attention that you have been introducing fanciful materials in your lessons. Poetry, stories about foreign cities, discussions of political events beyond our borders." "Poetry is part of any proper education," Eleanor replied, "as is geography and history. The children are hungry for knowledge." Franklin Pritchard leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "No one disputes the value of basic instruction, reading, writing, sums, but is it wise to fill their heads with ideas of other lives, other places? We need workers here, Miss Ashford, children who understand their role and accept their lot, not dreamers who'll grow discontent and run off to cities. Or worse," Charles Waverley added, "children who question their betters. I've heard reports that you've encouraged them to think critically about authority." Eleanor thought of the lesson on the Revolution, of Tom's sharp questions about fairness and representation. "I've encouraged them to think," she said, "to understand the world they live in. An educated child is less likely to be cheated, more likely to contribute meaningfully to any community, including this one." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Mary met Eleanor's gaze and nodded subtly. Judge Thorne tapped the table. "This is not Boston, Miss Ashford. Our needs are different. We cannot afford radical notions." "What precisely do you consider radical?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "Mrs." Thorne answered this time, eyes cool. "Sending a young woman alone into the woods in a storm, for one. Your excursion to the Barnett cabin caused quite a stir. You put yourself in danger. Had you been harmed, we would have been left without a teacher." "No one sent me," Eleanor said. "I went of my own accord because one of my students was in danger, and she is now recovering. Thanks to the timely assistance of my nephew," Judge Thorne said. "Which begs the question, what business has he involving himself in school matters?" "That's hardly fair," Mary Chen interjected from the benches. "If my Sarah were fevered, I'd pray for both the teacher and Magnus to come." "This is a school board meeting, Mrs. Chen," Pritchard snapped, "not a gossip circle. Kindly refrain from interruption." Mary's cheeks flushed, but she subsided, gripping James's hand. Pritchard turned back to Eleanor, smile reaffixed. "No one denies your enthusiasm, Miss Ashford, but some of us are concerned you are trying to change too much, too fast, introducing high-minded ideas, encouraging the children to dream beyond their station, allowing your personal history to color your approach." "What do you mean by that?" Eleanor asked, a chill crawling up her spine. He spread his hands. "Only that we all have pasts. Yours, for instance, includes a broken engagement and a bankrupt family. Hardly your fault, of course, but such experiences can make one bitter, perhaps overly zealous in chasing redemption through others." A few gasps sounded. The word bankrupt hung in the air like a bad smell. Eleanor's hand tightened in her lap until her knuckles went white. How did he know that? She'd spoken of it only in the vaguest terms. "My past is irrelevant to my competence," she said, forcing the words through a throat gone dry. "On the contrary," he said gently, his eyes gleaming. "Character is always relevant. We simply wish to ensure you are unstable, that your motives are pure, that you will not abandon these children as your fiancé abandoned you." The room went very still. Heat flared in Eleanor's cheeks, a mix of shame and fury. For a moment, everything narrowed to Pritchard's smug face, to the cruel curve of his mouth. She was back in Boston, hearing whispered words, ruined, jilted, useless. She tasted bile. Before she could respond, The hall door opened with a gust of cold air. Magnus Thorne stepped inside. He took in the scene in a single sweep, the table of board members, the crowded benches, Eleanor standing taut and pale. He removed his hat, snow scattering, and nodded once to the room. "Am I interrupting?" "Board meeting, Magnus," Judge Thorne said sharply. "You've no business here." "I do when my men's children are involved," Magnus replied, voice calm but carrying. "James told me there were questions about the school. Figured I should hear them." Pritchard's smile tightened. "We appreciate your interest, Mr. Thorne, but this is a matter for those who contribute financially to the town's institutions." A murmur went through the room. Everyone knew Magnus owned land and timber claims, but few grasped the full extent of his wealth. Magnus moved closer, and people instinctively shifted aside. "I contribute," he said quietly. "My taxes fund this school same as yours. My men's wages spent in your stores, their children sit in those benches." His gaze slid to Eleanor, then back to Pritchard. "So, if you're putting their teacher on trial, I'll hear the charges." "This is not a trial," Judge Thorne snapped, color rising in his cheeks. "It looks like one," Magnus said. 5 on 1. Questions about her character and motives. Smell of blood in the air." His eyes hardened. "That's a trial by any other name." Eleanor's heart thudded. No one had ever spoken in her defense so plainly in a public room, certainly not in Boston drawing rooms, where support came in the form of polite silence or discreet distance. Pritchard recovered his composure. "We simply wish to ensure Miss Ashford is not overstepping, filling children's heads with notions above their station, encouraging risk, bringing her own unfortunate history to bear on impressionable minds." Magnus's jaw flexed. "Her history, as you call it, shows she's seen life both high and low. Makes her more fit to teach, not less. She knows how fast fortune turns. She'll warn the children, if anything, not to trust in easy promises." Some of the parents nodded. Eleanor saw Mary's eyes shine. "And as for risk," Magnus went on, "she hiked alone through storm and mud to sit all night with a fevered child. Kept her alive until help could come. That's not recklessness. That's courage and competence. If you'd seen the men I've seen in winter camps, you'd know the difference." Judge Thorne's eyes flashed. "You speak as if you were there." "I was," Magnus said simply. "Arrived after midnight. She'd already done everything the doctor later recommended. Sponged, cooled, kept the girl drinking. Never once panicked." He turned fully to face him. "You and I both know not every woman of our acquaintance would have done the same." A flicker of something, guilt, annoyance, crossed the judge's face. Pritchard tried a different tack. "Even granting that instance of fortitude, we must consider the long-term influence on the children. She fills their heads with tales of cities and revolution. Next, they'll want to abandon logging altogether. Where will that leave our town? With children who can read contracts before they sign them," Magnus said, "who can't be cheated at the scales or in land deals. That might trouble some." His gaze bored into Pritchard now. "But it doesn't trouble me." A low, appreciative murmur rolled through the crowd. More than one man looked at Pritchard with new eyes. Color crept up Franklin's neck. "You imply—" "I imply nothing," Magnus interrupted mildly. "I state plain. An ignorant workforce is easier to control. That may suit your purposes. It doesn't suit mine." He gestured toward Eleanor. "She's taken children who could barely scratch their names and taught them to read newspapers in 2 months. She's given them stories that prove a life can be more than what it's been. If that frightens you, perhaps the problem isn't her curriculum." Pritchard's composure cracked. "You overstep, Thorne. This is not your domain. You live up in your cabin like some mountain bear. What do you know of civilized education?" "I know competence when I see it," Magnus replied. "I've hired and fired more men than you've shaken hands with. I can tell in a week whether someone will last a winter in camp. She's lasted more than that in this town, which might be harsher." He glanced toward Eleanor, and his voice softened almost imperceptibly. Too harsh at times. She felt the words like a hand reaching out in a crowd. She met his eyes and saw there not pity, but recognition. And something else. Respect. It warmed a place in her chest that had been cold for a long time. Judge Thorne rapped the table. "This is descending into disorder. The question is simple. Shall Miss Ashford be instructed to adhere strictly to basic curriculum, or shall she be given free rein to fill these children's heads with whatever fancies she pleases? Those are not the only options, Eleanor said quietly. All eyes turned to her. I do not teach whatever fancies I please. I choose materials because they illuminate reading, history, virtue, because they show courage, sacrifice, and justice. If you wish to review my lesson plans, I will gladly provide them. But I will not reduce education to mere letters and sums. These children deserve more. Silence stretched. Rain drummed on the roof. Then Mary stood. My Sarah comes home speaking words I never learned, she said. She reads labels now, she corrects my spelling. Laughter rippled. She also still helps with chores, still minds her parents. Her head hasn't flown off to Boston yet. I say, let the teacher teach. James rose beside her. Our boy Tom, he nodded toward the lanky figure slouched near the back, used to skip every chance he got. Now he hounds us to let him go, even when there's work at the mill. Says he wants to understand the world, whatever that means. Another ripple of amusement. He's no less strong for it, just sharper. I'd rather a son who thinks, even if it makes him question me now and then, than one who doesn't see trouble coming till it's on his doorstep. One by one, other parents spoke up. Mrs. Henderson, a man from the lower camp, even the quiet Barnetts who rarely came to town together. She saved our girl, Mr. Barnett said simply. You want to tell us she's not fit to teach because she cares too much? You'll have to say it to my face. The tide was turning, Eleanor felt it. Judge Thorne scowled, sensing it too. This is not a popularity contest, he said. We cannot run a school by mob sentiment. No, Magnus agreed. We run it by what's best for the children. And if you can't see that this woman is an asset to them, then perhaps it's not her judgment that should be in question. His uncle's eyes snapped to him. Years of unspoken conflict flickered between them in that charged glance. The room held its breath. At last the judge exhaled sharply. Very well, he said grudgingly. The board will allow Miss Ashford to continue her current curriculum for the present term. We will review again in spring, provided, he pinned her with a cold stare, there are no further out excursions into unnecessary risk. Eleanor inclined her head, needing no prompting to accept the half-victory. I understand, she said, and I appreciate the board's consideration. The meeting broke up in a flurry of relieved conversation. People filed out into the rain, some pausing to grip Eleanor's hand, to clap her shoulder, to murmur thanks. The children, allowed to attend on the condition of silence, erupted into whispers as soon as they reached the boardwalk. You showed 'em, Miss Ashford, Tom blurted as he passed. Especially Mr. Pritchard. Language, Tom, she chided automatically, though her lips twitched. And I did nothing alone. Your parents spoke bravely. They learned bravery somewhere, Magnus said behind her. She turned. He stood by the door, hat in hand, rain beading on his hair and beard. With the crowd thinning, he seemed taller than ever, a solid presence against the uncertain night. Thank you, she said, the words inadequate for what he'd done. You didn't have to. Yes, he interrupted gently. I did. He glanced toward where Pritchard lingered under an awning watching them. Men like him count on no one speaking up, on everyone being too worried about standing out. You stood alone long enough in there. It was time someone else did. His directness made her eyes sting unexpectedly. She looked away, swallowing. Still, it means more than I can say. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with praise. My men's children sit in your classroom. You've given them more in a month than most folks gave me in my whole schooling. I won't see that squandered because some men fear losing their grip. You talk as if you weren't educated, she said, curiosity slipping out. He huffed a soft breath that might almost have been a laugh. I sat in a classroom for a few years. Letters, numbers, enough to read a timber survey, but most of what I know I learned the hard way. Balancing accounts by lantern light, negotiating with men who thought a big body meant a small brain, figuring interest on loans so my uncle couldn't cheat me out of land that was mine by right. His gaze softened. Your pupils will have an easier time of it thanks to you. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming on the church roof. Eleanor shivered, her damp coat no match for the wind. You'll catch your death walking home in that, Magnus said, frowning. Come, I'll see you to the Hendersons. That's hardly necessary, she began, then stopped at his look. It's black as a quarry out there, the boardwalk's slick, and there's a section by the mill that washes out in heavy rain, he said. Humour me." He did not offer his arm exactly, not like a Boston gentleman would. Instead, he walked half a step ahead, placing his body between her and the worst of the wind. His stride was long, but he checked it regularly to match hers. When they reached the treacherous stretch where water rushed over the boards in a shallow, hidden stream, he paused. "Hold on," he said. Before she could protest, he lifted her as easily as if she were a bundle of kindling. For a heartbeat, Eleanor forgot how to breathe. Her hands flew to his shoulders, fingers digging into hard muscle through wet wool. He stepped across the flooded spot in 2 strides and set her down gently on solid boards again. "I could have," she began weakly, but the words died as she met his gaze. "Fallen and broken your neck?" he asked, one brow lifting. "Then where would your pupils be?" His tone was light, but there was an underlying seriousness she couldn't ignore. She realized with a start that he wasn't treating her like something fragile to be coddled, nor like a problem to be scolded and contained. He was treating her like someone whose work mattered, someone worth protecting for what she did, not just who she was. It was a new sensation. "Thank you," she said again, quieter. He nodded once. For a moment, they stood in the rain, the town around them reduced to soft pools of lamplight and shadow. The air smelled of wet earth and sawdust. Somewhere a dog barked. The river roared invisible in the darkness. "Magnus," she said impulsively, "may I ask you something?" He tilted his head. "You've earned one question at least. Why do you live up there alone?" She nodded toward the looming silhouette of the mountain. "You could have a fine house in town, servants, a place at your uncle's table." A muscle jumped in his jaw. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Because once I trusted a room full of people like this one to do right by someone I loved. They didn't, or wouldn't, or were too cowardly, so I decided I'd rather trust trees and stone than men and their talk." He looked down at her, something raw in his eyes. "Tonight, I saw a room choose differently. Saw you stand, and others stand with you. He paused, searching for a word. "It shifted something." Her breath caught. "In what way?" "In the way a hillside shifts after a hard rain," he said slowly. "Small at first, but you know something's moved under the surface. Might change the whole course of a stream, given time." She thought of the way the parents had spoken, of the glances exchanged, the murmurs when Pritchard's motives were questioned. A stream rerouting around an obstacle. "I didn't plan any of that," she said. "I only couldn't bear to be silent. That's often how change starts." His voice was almost gentle, with someone refusing to shut their mouth when they're told to. They reached the Hendersons' gate. Light spilled from the front window, warm and inviting. Eleanor hesitated, not wanting to end the moment just yet. "Will you let me thank you properly?" she asked. "Perhaps with a meal. I'm sure Mrs. Henderson would be pleased to have you." He shook his head. "I'm leaving at first light. Snowstorm coming in 2 days. Need to move the higher camp down the slope before it hits." He hesitated, then added, "But I'll send James to tell you when we're back in the lower camp for winter. If you still wish to cook for a man who eats like a bear, you can extend the invitation then." A smile tugged at her mouth. "I've fed ravenous schoolchildren. I think I can manage one lumberjack." His answering huff of laughter was soft but real. "We'll see, Miss Ashford." He dipped his head in a half-bow more sincere than any she'd received in Boston ballrooms. "Good night. Good night, Mr. Thorne." He turned and walked back into the rain, his broad back quickly swallowed by the dark. Eleanor watched until he was out of sight, one hand resting on the gatepost to steady herself against the strange fluttering in her chest. Inside, Mrs. Henderson exclaimed over her wet hair and thrust a towel into her hands. "We heard there was a row at the meeting," she said. "Mary came by, said Magnus Thorne himself spoke up for you." "He did," Eleanor said softly, toweling her hair. "So did many others." Mrs. Henderson smiled, eyes crinkling. "Well then, seems you're not just the city girl anymore, are you? You're ours now. Timber Ridge doesn't always take kindly to change, but when it does, it holds on." Later, alone in her narrow bed, listening to the rain drumming on the roof, Eleanor thought of Magnus's words, of stumps and regrets, of streams changing course after a storm, of the way his hands had felt briefly when he'd lifted her, solid and sure. She had come to this mountain thinking she would teach children their letters, and then perhaps find some modest, safe life. Instead, she was finding herself drawn into currents she hadn't anticipated, into battles and loyalties and connections that felt as wild and dangerous as the forest itself. And somewhere high above, under a roof of rough timber, a giant of a man lay awake longer than usual, replaying a scene in a crowded hall. A slender woman standing straight, despite the weight of old shame, refusing to bow. His own voice, louder than it had been in years, cutting through murmurs, the look in her eyes when he called her strong. He turned on his pallet, listening to the wind in the trees, and wondered, against his better judgment, what might happen if he allowed the course of his own life to shift, even slightly, toward the city girl who had chosen to stand when it counted. By mid-December, Timber Ridge lay wrapped in white, the town's rough edges softened beneath drifts that climbed halfway up cabin walls. Smoke rose straight into a sky bleached pale by cold. The river ran dark and narrow between ice-crusted banks, its roar muffled. Every sound seemed sharper in the frigid air, the creak of wagon wheels, the chop of axes, the distant echo of trees snapping under the weight of wind and snow. For Eleanor, winter brought new challenges to the schoolhouse. Boots tramped in slush that quickly turned to slick ice on the floorboards, little hands chapped and cracked around pencils. Breath fogged in the air each morning, until the stove grudgingly heated, chewing through the meager supply of wood stacked by the door. One Monday, she arrived to find the woodpile gone, nothing but a dusting of snow against the wall. Her heart sank. She'd asked the board for an increased fuel allowance before the first snow. Pritchard had assured her it would be taken under advisement. Apparently, it had been advised away. The room was bitterly cold. Her breath curled white as she stood in the doorway. She could not ask the children to sit in such a chill, not for hours. She turned and strode to the church hall, where Mrs. Bledsoe was setting out hymnals for evening service. "The wood for the schoolhouse is gone," Eleanor said without preamble. "We'll freeze if we try to hold lessons." Mrs. Bledsoe looked flustered. "I'm sure it's just a delay in delivery. The board has been occupied with other matters." "Then perhaps the board might consider that 30 children will be sitting in their coats and mittens instead of learning," Eleanor replied, more sharply than she'd intended. "I don't control the wood allocations," Mrs. Bledsoe said helplessly. "You'll have to speak with Mr. Pritchard. He oversees supplies for public buildings." "Of course he does," Eleanor thought. She thanked Mrs. Bledsoe and marched straight to Pritchard's office. He greeted her with a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Ashford, to what do I owe the pleasure on this brisk morning?" "The school has no wood," she said. "Without fuel, I cannot hold classes. I need an immediate delivery." He tutted sympathetically. "Such a shame. Unfortunately, the winter stores are tighter than anticipated. The mill requires more than usual to keep the machinery from freezing. Until the next shipment arrives by river, I'm afraid we must prioritize." "Prioritize profit over children?" she asked, incredulous. "Prioritize the lifeblood of this town," he countered smoothly. "Without the mill, there is no Timber Ridge. Surely you understand." "I understand that a town that chooses to starve its school will one day wonder why no one can read the ledgers," she said, anger kindling. "You assured me at the last meeting that education was valued here." "And it is," he said, spreading his hands. "But we must be realistic. The children can survive a day or two without lessons. The mill cannot survive burst pipes and cracked gears. It's simply a matter of necessity." She realized then that this wasn't negligence, it was strategy. Pritchard had seen his influence challenged during the board meeting. This was his answer, a quiet, plausible punishment dressed as hard-headed practicality. Very well, she thought. If he meant to test her resolve, he would see she was harder to break than he believed. "Thank you for your time," she said coolly, and left before he could reply. Outside, the cold air burned her lungs. She stared at the snow-blanketed street, her mind racing. The children were already on their way. She couldn't simply send them home. Parents would grumble. Some might even pull their support, believing the school unreliable. That would please Pritchard well enough. She needed wood. Her gaze drifted, almost of its own accord, toward the road leading up the mountain. Somewhere up there, Magnus's camp was shifting from high elevation to winter ground, dragging logs and equipment, battling the same snow that now lay thick around her feet. She had no right to call on him. He had his own concerns, his own work. Yet she remembered the night in the Barnett cabin, his steady presence, the way he'd stood for her in the church hall, unasked. His promise, send word if you ever have need on the mountain roads. It wasn't the mountain roads she needed help with now. It was the frozen ground of Timber Ridge itself. She returned to the schoolhouse and found a cluster of children waiting on the steps, stamping their feet and blowing on their fingers. "Miss Ashford, it's freezing in there," Sarah said, teeth chattering. "I know," Eleanor said. "We'll be out here only a moment, then we'll warm up properly, I promise." She beckoned to James, the quiet boy with the quick head for numbers. "James, could you run an errand for me?" He straightened. "Yes, ma'am. Go to the Chen house. Ask Mary if she'll send word to Magnus Thorne's camp that the schoolhouse needs wood. Tell her I wouldn't ask if it weren't urgent." His eyes widened, but he nodded. "I'll go right now." "Thank you." She watched him lope off through the snow, then ushered the children inside. The room was like an icebox. She had them keep their coats and scarves on, huddling together on benches. She led them in multiplication tables and spelling bees, anything to keep them talking, moving, warming themselves through activity. Their laughter puffed in white clouds. Her fingers went numb around the chalk. Time dragged. The small clock on the wall ticked, its sound loud in the cold air. She began to doubt herself. Perhaps she'd overstepped, asking Mary to contact Magnus. Perhaps he would be offended, or simply too busy. Perhaps Pritchard's voice had more weight even in the lumber camps than she realized. The door burst open with a rush of frigid air and snow. Two of Magnus's men stepped in, arms laden with split logs. Behind them, Magnus himself filled the doorway like a moving wall, his coat dusted white. The children gasped. The mountain giant, here, in their school. "Where do you want it?" one of the men asked. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. "By the stove, please." "Thank you." They stacked the wood quickly, efficiently. Magnus set down his own armful, then inspected the stove with a practiced eye. "Flue's half clogged," he muttered. He shrugged out of his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and set to work. Soot streaked his forearms as he dismantled the pipe, knocked free creosote and ash, reassembled the contraption with the ease of long familiarity. Then he laid a fire, paper, kindling, logs, lit it, and coaxed it to a strong, steady burn. The children watched wide-eyed, whispering. Eleanor stood near the blackboard, uncertain whether to laugh or cry from relief. "Thank you," she said when the fire crackled cheerfully in the stove. "This is more than I expected." Magnus wiped his hands on a rag one of his men offered. "Mary's boy said the teacher was about to turn to ice," he said. "Can't have that. My men's children learn better with all their fingers." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the room. Some of the tension melted from Eleanor's shoulders. "I asked Pritchard for wood," she said quietly. "He claimed the mill needed it more." Magnus's mouth tightened. Of course he did. He glanced at the stacked logs. More than enough for a week. "This is from my camp, bought and paid for. If anyone has a complaint, they can bring it to me." "I'm sure they will," she said wryly, possibly in very large, official words. He huffed a short breath that might have been a laugh. "They can use all the long words they like. Winter doesn't care for talk." His gaze shifted to the children. "You lot," his voice carried easily. "If anyone asks where this wood came from, you tell them the mountain giant doesn't let his crew's children freeze while the mill's gears stay warm, understood?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," erupted. Even Tom Waverley, slouched in the back, sat up straighter. Magnus nodded once. "Good." He turned back to Eleanor. "You'll need more with the cold we're due to get. I'll have James," he tipped his head toward his man, not the boy, "swing by every few days to check. No charge." She opened her mouth to protest, to speak of fairness and debt, but the words tangled with gratitude in her throat. "I can't let you do that for nothing. The school board will insist." "The board has had its chance to provide," he said. "They chose not to. This is between me and the children now. You just keep teaching." His gaze softened slightly. "Seems to me that's payment enough." Her cheeks warmed more from his words than from the growing heat in the room. "Very well," she said, "but I'll find a way to repay you, Mr. Thorne. One day." "We'll argue about that later," he said, shrugging his coat back on. "For now I've a snow-laden ridge to check. The storm that's coming isn't friendly. Be careful, she said, surprising herself. His eyes met hers. In them she saw a flicker of something rare, someone unaccustomed to being worried over, registering the weight of her concern. You too, Miss Ashford, he replied. Storms hit towns as hard as camps, just in different ways. He left in a swirl of cold air and snowflakes, his men behind him. The door shut, the latch clicked, and warmth began to seep into the room. The children surged forward, crowding around the stove, chattering about the mountain giant fixing their fire. That was amazing, Sarah whispered. He's like those giants in the stories, only nice. Not to those who cross him, Tom muttered, though there was grudging admiration in his tone. Back to your seats, Eleanor said, clapping her hands. We've lost enough time to cold. Let's make use of the warmth he brought us. As they settled, she caught herself glancing at the door more than once, as if expecting him to reappear. He did not, but the room held a trace of his presence, the scent of pine and cold air, the memory of his large hands blackened with soot as he worked without complaint. That evening, after the children left, Eleanor lingered by the stove, feeding another log to the hungry flames. Mrs. Henderson bustled in with a basket of mending and nearly dropped it when the heat hit her. Mercy, it's like a summer day in here, she exclaimed. What happened? The mountain giant happened, Eleanor said softly and explained. Mrs. Henderson's smile was knowing. Oh, he did he? Well, men show their feelings in all manner of ways. Some bring flowers, some bring wood in a snowstorm. Eleanor bristled, more from embarrassment than denial. He was helping the children, not courting the teacher. Of course he was, Mrs. Henderson said easily. And yet here you are, glowing like that stove. Don't mind me. I'm just an old woman who's seen how these things begin. Alone later in her small room, Eleanor thought of all the hands that had shaped her life thus far. Her father's, pushing ledgers toward her with a distracted smile, her former fiancés, turned away from her when the fortune vanished, the gloved hands of gossiping women fluttering like nervous birds. Then she thought of Magnus's hands, rough and sure, building fires, tending fevers, lifting her over flooded planks. Hands that did, rather than merely gestured. Hands that spoke of a man who built, repaired, persevered. She should not be so affected by a few acts of kindness, and yet, when she closed her eyes, it was not Boston ballrooms she dreamed of, but a warm schoolroom in midwinter, and a giant of a man standing by a stove promising her, without saying the words, that she and her pupils would not be left in the cold. The storm Magnus had warned of arrived 3 days later, with a fury that justified his caution. Snow fell for 36 hours straight, piling in drifts as high as Eleanor's waist. The town retreated indoors, fires banked high, doors barred against the howl of the wind. School closed for 2 days. No child could safely navigate streets where one misstep meant vanishing into a hidden trench. On the 3rd day, when the storm finally blew itself out, the sky shone a brittle, dazzling blue. The world sparkled. Timber Ridge emerged cautiously, blinking in the hard sunlight. The snow had shifted more than just the landscape. News spread quickly from the mountain. A slide had hit one of Magnus's supply sheds, burying equipment and nearly trapping 3 men. Only quick thinking and faster digging had saved them. One had broken an arm, another had a deep gash in his leg. Magnus himself had wrenched his shoulder, hauling a man clear, but had refused to leave the site until every shovel of snow was accounted for. The injured men were brought down to town, one to the small infirmary, one to Mary Chen's house, which had become an unofficial way station for those caught between camp and home. Eleanor heard all this in snatches from parents at the schoolhouse door, from Mrs. Henderson's running commentary, from Mary herself when she stopped by, cheeks flushed, apron stained with blood and broth. He wouldn't let anyone see to that shoulder until his men were settled, Mary said, half exasperated, half admiring. Stood there in the snow, white as the drifts, barking orders with his arm hanging like a dead branch. Finally, James threatened to drag him to the doctor by his beard if he didn't move. Is he badly hurt? Eleanor asked, trying to keep the worry from her voice. Doctor says it's a strain, maybe a partial dislocation, Mary replied. Painful, but he'll mend if he rests. Which, knowing Magnus, means he'll be out hauling logs again tomorrow. The thought of him pushing through that kind of pain made something twist in Eleanor's chest. "He shouldn't be alone," she said softly. "He's not," Mary said. "Half the camp's fussing over him like a brood of hens." "Still," she gave Eleanor a shrewd look. "You know, Miss Ashford, soup travels just as well up a mountain trail as down." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest and stopped. She thought of all he had done for her and the school, of the quiet way he'd stepped between her and Pritchard's malice, of the wood stacked neatly by her stove. A pot of soup seemed a small thing suddenly. "I'm sure the trail is treacherous after the storm," she said, more to herself than to Mary. Mary's smile was slow and knowing. "It is. Good thing there are men in camp who know every inch of it and would be happy to escort a certain determined teacher, if she asked." That night, Eleanor found herself at the Henderson stove, stirring a pot of thick stew. Venison, potatoes, onions, and herbs Mrs. Henderson had dried in summer. The older woman watched with raised brows, but said nothing until the pot was covered and tied securely in a basket alongside a loaf of fresh bread. "Take my shawl," she said, handing over a heavy wool wrap, "and mind your step. Snow hides all manner of dangers." Eleanor nodded, heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside. She stepped into the night, the basket's handle biting into her gloved fingers. The stars burned hard and bright above, closer than they seemed in Boston. Her breath rose in little clouds. Snow squeaked underfoot. At the base of the mountain road, a familiar figure waited, lantern swinging from his hand. James Chen. "Mary said you might be coming," he said with a grin. "Figured I'd save you from wandering into a ravine." "Thank you," she said, relieved. "I don't want to be a burden. Taking Stu to the boss after he saved my mate's leg?" James shook his head. "That's not a burden, miss. That's justice." They began the climb, the lantern casting a small circle of light that bobbed ahead of them. The forest was a different world at night, shadow and silver, branches heavy with snow, the air so still, each footstep sounded like a shout. Twice, James caught her elbow as she slipped. Once, they heard the distant crack of a branch overloaded with ice. By the time the camp lights came into view, a cluster of golden glows among the dark trunks, Eleanor's thighs burned, and her fingers were numb despite her gloves. Her breath came in sharp pants. "You all right?" James asked, glancing back. "Yes," she said, straightening. "Just not used to climbing mountains after a day teaching fractions." He laughed softly. "You'll be running up here come spring at this rate." The camp was a rough village of cabins and sheds, paths trampled into the snow. Men paused to stare as James led her past, their surprise quickly turning into nods of respect once they recognized her. News of the Barnett vigil, of the board meeting, of the wood delivery, had clearly made its way up the mountain. "She's for the boss," James said under his breath when one man opened his mouth to comment. The fellow closed it quickly, an expression of exaggerated innocence taking its place. Magnus's cabin stood slightly apart, sturdier and larger than the others, but still plain. No ornament beyond a neat stack of wood by the door and a pair of snowshoes hanging on the wall. James knocked once, then twice more in a particular rhythm, and opened the door without waiting for a response. "Guest for you," he said cheerfully and stepped aside. Eleanor moved past him, suddenly and acutely aware of the heat in her cheeks, the basket on her arm, the snow clinging to her skirt. The cabin's warmth hit her like a physical thing. The air smelled of pine resin, smoke, leather, and something unmistakably him. Magnus sat at a rough-hewn table, his left arm in a sling, shirt loose at the collar. A half-finished ledger lay open before him, figures marching across the page. The sight of him out of his coat in such a domestic pose startled her more than the climb had. He looked up, and for a moment surprise flickered plainly across his face. Then he stood, or tried to. Pain pinched his features, and he gripped the table with his good hand. "You shouldn't get up," she blurted, then flushed. "Forgive me, I didn't mean to order you about in your own home." He sank back onto the bench with a wry huff. "Pain's a good teacher. Sit, Miss Ashford, before you fall over from the climb." She realized then that her legs were indeed trembling. She set the basket carefully on the table and lowered herself onto the bench opposite him. "I brought stew," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "Mary told me what happened in the slide. I thought, Well, you brought warmth to my school. It seemed only right to bring some back. His gaze dropped to the basket, then returned to her face with an intensity that made her want to look away and lean closer in the same instant. You climbed this mountain in the dark with a pot of stew because you thought it only right. Yes, she said, chin lifting. Is that so strange? In my experience, he said slowly, people are quick to take what I give and slow to return anything that costs them effort. His mouth curved, not quite a smile. So, yes, it's strange. In the best possible way, James, sensing he was no longer needed, made a show of checking the lantern. You holler when you're ready to go back down, miss, he said. I'll be outside. Boss, if you do anything foolish with that shoulder, I'll tell Mary. Go, Magnus said, half amused, half exasperated. When the door closed, a different kind of quiet settled. Close, intimate. The storm of nerves in Eleanor's stomach intensified. She busied herself with the stew, removing the lid, the rich scent of meat and herbs filling the cabin. She tore the bread, hands steadying as she moved through the practical tasks. He watched her, the unreadable expressions softened by the lamplight. They ate together at the simple table, the only sound the clink of spoons against tin bowls and the occasional crack of settling logs in the hearth. Outside, night pressed against the small windows. Inside, the light pooled warm and golden around them. How bad is it? She asked quietly after a while, nodding toward his sling. Could be worse, he said. Could have been the men pinned under the slide instead of me pulling them out. He met her gaze. They're both alive because we moved fast. That's worth a sore shoulder. You always speak as if your own well-being is a minor inconvenience, she said. Does it ever occur to you that others might feel differently? He blinked, caught off guard. About my well-being? Yes. The word came out more sharply than she intended. Your men. Mary and James. Even perhaps... She swallowed the rest. Even perhaps the teacher, he supplied, voice very soft. Heat rose in her cheeks. You've become important to my students, she said, skirting the more dangerous truth. They look up to you. If you were lost in one of those slides, it would leave more than a gap in a payroll ledger. He looked at her for a long moment. I never thought much about who'd miss me, he admitted. Not beyond the bookkeeping. That sounds bleak, said out loud. Bleak and honest, she said gently. But not entirely true, I think. Your actions ripple further than you allow yourself to see. He leaned back carefully, eyes narrowing in thought. I could say the same of you, he said. You stand in that schoolhouse chalk in hand and think you're just teaching sums and letters, but you're changing the course of entire lives. Those children will walk through the world differently because of what you're giving them. No more than any decent teacher, she protested. Plenty of teachers do less, he said. Plenty of women in your position would have given up after the first hard week, or gone running to Pritchard with apologies and promises to be more pliant. Disgust curled his lip at the last word. You didn't. You bent the town around you instead, little by little. Not alone, she said quietly. I've had help. You've had allies, he agreed, but you lit the fire they're warming their hands by. His gaze drifted to the hearth, then back. Fitting that you and I keep trading warmth, wood for stew, defense for stubbornness. His mouth twitched. If we keep this up, we'll have to call it a partnership. The word hung between them, heavy with more than one meaning. A partnership, she repeated, heart thudding. In making something better than what we started with, he said. You build minds. I build livelihoods. Both can be changed, improved, together. He spread his good hand as if seeing a shape forming in the space between them. There's something there. Can't quite name it yet. She understood on a level beyond words. She felt it in the way their days intersected now. Not just by accident, but by choice. In the way she found herself thinking of how his men's children would receive a lesson. In the way he now considered the school in his calculations of lumber and supplies. We're both trying to carve something human out of a hard place, she said. You with your timber, me with my books. And with our own pasts, he murmured, almost to himself. Silence fell, charged. The past. There it was, hovering unspoken between them. Boston, the estranged uncle, the choices that had led them both to this mountain. She could keep the conversation on safe ground, or she could step forward, across a line she'd drawn around her heart. She chose to step. "May I ask you something personal?" she said. He considered, then nodded. "You've earned another question." "What happened?" she asked. "Between you and your uncle. You spoke of trusting a room and being disappointed, but not of the particulars." He went very still. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd overreached. Then he said, "My father died in a logging accident when I was 19. My uncle was executor of the estate. There was land, ours, and debts, his." In the confusion, lines blurred. Suddenly what had been my inheritance became collateral. The board, he gave a small, bitter smile, met to decide what was best for the family. "And they chose against you," she guessed. "They chose for themselves," he said, "but I was stronger and more stubborn than they'd accounted for. I found the papers, learned the numbers, fought back, kept enough land to start a camp. But the cost was ties severed, names spoken coldly, if at all. And you've carried that alone ever since," she said softly. "Better alone than beholden to men who'd gut you for your timber," he said, but the words lacked heat. "Still, there are nights I wonder what it would have been like to have a family that didn't see me as a ledger entry." She thought of her own father, flawed and distracted but never deliberately cruel. "I'm sorry," she said. "You deserved better than that." His gaze met hers, the unguarded pain there making her chest tight. "We don't always get what we deserve," he said. "But sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get something else. Something we never thought to ask for." He looked around the cabin at the stew, the bread, then back at her, like a teacher from Boston climbing a mountain with soup. Her own secrets pressed against her ribs, wanting out. She swallowed hard. "My father didn't cheat me," she said. "He cheated himself. Took risks he didn't understand in markets he thought he'd mastered. Lost everything. When the creditors came, we discovered he'd mortgaged not just the house, but our future. The man I was to marry said he could forgive the scandal, but not the burden." The word still tasted like rust. "So he released me from the engagement, as if he were doing me a kindness." Magnus's jaw clenched. "Coward." "At the time, I thought I was the coward," she said. "I'd let my life be arranged around parties and prospects, net worth and names. When it all vanished, I realized how little substance I had beyond those trappings. Coming here was—" she searched for the word. "An attempt to prove to myself that I could exist without all that, that I could contribute something real." "Have you proved it?" he asked quietly. She thought of Sarah's eager questions, Tom's newfound concentration, the Barnetts' gratitude, of the board meeting, the parents' voices rising in her defense, of Magnus himself sitting across from her now because she'd become someone whose concerns he respected. "Yes," she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "I think I have." "Then the fall did its work," he said. "Smashed what needed smashing so something stronger could be built." He looked at her with something fierce and bright in his eyes. "You're more woman now than any spoiled girl who waltzed through Boston ballrooms on your father's name." The compliment hit her with unexpected force. Tears pricked her eyes. She blinked them back, but one escaped, hot against her chilled cheek. Without thinking, he reached across the table with his good hand. His fingers brushed her cheek, rough thumb catching the tear before it fell. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. Her breath hitched, his hand stilled, cupping her jaw. Their eyes locked. The air between them changed, thickened, charged, as if the cabin were suddenly holding its breath alongside them. "Eleanor," he murmured, her name a rough caress in his mouth. She leaned just slightly into his palm. Magnus. For a long, suspended moment, nothing else existed. Not the storm scars on the mountain, not the board's disapproval, not Boston's gossip. Just the warmth of his hand on her skin, the steady beat of his pulse under her fingertips where she'd laid her own hand atop his, the quiet promise in his gaze. Then a shout sounded outside, followed by the crunch of boots approaching the door. The spell snapped like a twig underfoot. Magnus's hand dropped. He inhaled sharply, as if he'd been underwater. Eleanor jerked back, heart pounding, face flaming. James's voice came through the door. "Miss, we ought to start down if you want to be in town before the moon goes behind the ridge." "Of course," she called, though her voice came out thinner than she liked. She rose, fumbling with the basket lids, her hands clumsy. Magnus stood more slowly, wincing as his shoulder reminded him of its injury. At the door, she hesitated. He stood close enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. Snowlight and lamplight mingled, painting his features in soft gold and blue. "Thank you," he said, voice low. "For the stew, for the climb, for everything." She swallowed. "Thank you," she replied. "For the wood, for the defense, for seeing more in me than—" she faltered. "Than those Boston fools ever did," he finished for her. His mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something warmer. "Go slow on the trail." She stepped out into the cold, the night air sharp on her flushed skin. James fell into step beside her, lantern held high. They descended in careful silence, the world awash of silver and shadow. Eleanor's cheek still tingled where Magnus's thumb had stroked away her tear. His unfinished movement toward her lingered like a question in the air between their hearts. A partnership, he had called it. She wondered, as she followed the bobbing lantern light down the mountain path, how long it would be before one of them dared to give that word its truest name. The thaw did not come gently. Late winter in Timber Ridge was a season of betrayal, days teased with unexpected warmth, sunshine glancing off snowbanks, roofs dripping steadily, children shedding mittens in the midday glow. Then night would slam down hard and cold, turning meltwater to treacherous ice, cracking wagon wheels and bones alike. It was on one such day, a false spring morning with a deceptive softness in the air, that the mountain reminded everyone who truly ruled this land. Classes had gone well that morning. The children were restless, eyes drifting toward the windows where sunlight dazzled off the remaining snow. Eleanor indulged them with a lesson on geography, letting Sarah draw a map of the mountain on the board, while Tom labeled the logging camps and river bends. "Remember," she said, tapping the chalk at a narrow valley between two drawn ridges, "when snow melts too quickly, the water needs somewhere to go. If it's blocked by ice or debris, pressure builds. That can cause—" "Floods," James supplied. "Or slides," Eleanor added. "Mud, rocks, even trees can come tumbling down with it." Tom snorted. "Magnus says he can read the snow, says he knows when a slope's ready to go." "I'm sure he can," Eleanor said, an irrational shiver crawling up her spine. "He's lived on this mountain long enough to know its moods." "Sides," Tom added. "He's too big to be carried off. Mountain had just spit him back out." The children laughed. The tension eased. Eleanor smiled, but something about the conversation lodged in her mind like a splinter. After dismissal, she stayed late to mark slates and tidy. The sun slanted across the desks, turning dust motes to gold. Somewhere in town, a dog barked. Wagon wheels creaked. The world seemed almost peaceful. Then the ground shuddered. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration under her boots, like a heavy wagon rolling by. The inkwell on her desk trembled, dark surface rippling. The stove rattled. Eleanor straightened, heart leaping. A second later, a low, distant roar reached her ears. Not thunder, not wind, something heavier, deeper, growing. She moved to the door and flung it open. Down the main street, people were emerging from buildings, faces turned toward the mountain. The sound grew, a terrible grinding rush like the earth itself being dragged. A man near the general store shouted, pointing. Eleanor followed his gesture. High on the slope above Timber Ridge, a white tongue of snow and debris was breaking free from a ravine she'd never noticed before. It began as a sliding peel, then gained speed, gathering rocks, uprooted saplings, chunks of old ice. It plowed downward, unstoppable, carving a new scar on the mountain's face. "Slide!" someone screamed. "From the North Gully!" "The logging road!" another voice cried. "They've got crews up there today!" Eleanor's heart seized. Magnus. For a moment she couldn't move. The world narrowed to the line of destruction cutting toward the lower camps. She saw, in her mind's eye, men on the road, wagons loaded with timber, the sudden, sickening realization as the mountain above them began to move. Then she was running. She didn't think, didn't weigh the futility or the danger. She grabbed her cloak from its peg as she flew past, barely managing to fasten it around her shoulders. People shouted as she passed them, some calling her name. She barely heard. The road out of town was a mix of slush and mud, slick underfoot. The air, moments ago mild, now tasted of crushed ice and torn earth. The roar from above was fading, replaced by panicked voices, the distant whinnying of terrified horses. At the edge of town, a horse and cart nearly ran her down. She leapt aside, skidding, caught herself on a fence post. Her lungs burned. "You can't go up there," someone yelled behind her. "It's not safe." "Neither is being buried alive," she shot back, not even sure who she was answering. She kept running. The path toward the lower camp felt longer than it ever had when she'd walked it with Mary in gentler weather. Snowmelt ran in little rivulets along the edges, turning patches of ground to sucking mud. Her boots slipped more than once. Each time she forced herself back up, mind fixed on one image, Magnus standing in the path of the slide, arm in a sling, trying to haul others out of danger. "You're being a fool," a small voice whispered. "What can you do up there? You're a teacher, not a rescuer." "I can carry water," she answered it fiercely. "I can bind wounds. I can hold a hand while someone dies." The last thought made her stumble. She pushed harder. By the time she reached the outskirts of the lower camp, the slide had already passed, leaving a jagged fan of snow, mud, and splintered wood in its wake. Part of the supply yard was buried. A wagon lay on its side, half submerged, one wheel spinning slowly. Men moved around it like ants, shouting, digging with shovels and bare hands. Eleanor paused, chest heaving, trying to take in the chaos. Then she spotted Mary Chen, skirts hitched, hair loose under her kerchief, hauling a bucket toward a group kneeling by a prone figure. "Mary," Eleanor called. Mary's head snapped up. For an instant, disbelief crossed her face. Then she thrust the bucket into someone else's hands and ran to meet Eleanor. "What are you doing here?" she cried. "You should be in town." "I heard, saw—" Eleanor managed between gasps. "Is he—" "Alive," Mary said, understanding without needing the name. "He was above the worst of it. Took a hit from a log on that bad shoulder, though. And there are 3 others who weren't so lucky." Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "1 gone, 2 hurt bad." "Show me where I can help," Eleanor said. Mary didn't waste time arguing. She grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her toward the main cluster of activity. They passed the body first, the one who hadn't made it. A man Eleanor didn't know well, his face already sheeted with a blanket, boots protruding. 2 men stood over him, hats in hand, expressions drawn. There would be time for grief later. Beyond, under a makeshift tarp strung between 2 poles, lay the injured. One had a blood-soaked bandage around his thigh, jaw clenched against groans. The other— Eleanor's stomach lurched. His arm lay at an unnatural angle, bone pressing against skin. "Doctor's on his way from town," Mary said, "but he's got old Sawyer to tend and now this. We're trying to keep him from bleeding out before he gets here." Eleanor's nurse memories stirred. "Tighten that bandage," she told the man at the wounded thigh. "Higher, above the break. We need to slow the blood." She knelt by the man with the broken arm. "Use these boards as a splint until the doctor can set it," she continued, reaching for a pair of sturdy planks nearby. "We can't fix this properly without him, but we can keep it from getting worse." "Listen to the teacher," someone said. She kept Barnett's girl from crossing the river. As they worked, the camp's noise shifted around them, shouted orders, the scrape of shovels, the grunt of men hauling debris. Somewhere, someone cursed the mountain. Someone else cursed their own carelessness. Through it all, Eleanor kept moving, her world narrowing to cloth, wood, blood. Only when the badly wounded were as stable as they could be did she allow herself to ask, "Where is he?" "Stubborn fools over there," Mary said, jerking her chin toward a quieter corner of the yard. "Won't sit still. Claims he needs to oversee the digging. As if the men would suddenly forget how to move snow without him breathing down their necks." Eleanor followed the direction of her gesture. Magnus stood near the edge of the slide's path, his sling now empty and hanging useless at his side. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, exposing angry bruising and swelling. He held his left arm close to his body, face pale beneath his beard. Yet he was still giving orders, his voice carrying, his good arm indicating where to dig, where to shore up the unstable edges. "Thorne," one of the men called, "that section's shifting again." "I see it," he barked. "Pull back 2 yards, take the lower side first, leave the rest for now." He turned as Eleanor approached, eyes widening in surprise, and something else, something that made her chest tighten. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, echoing Mary's earlier question, but in a different tone. Less disbelief, more fear. "Helping," she said, meeting his gaze. "Unless you'd rather I stand in town and wring my hands." He opened his mouth, closed it, then grimaced, as a movement sent pain lancing through his shoulder. The grimace undid her. "You need to sit down," she said, stepping closer. "You're about to fall down whether you admit it or not." "I'm fine," he growled. "There's work to—" She did something, then she'd never done to a man in authority in her life. She interrupted. "Stop," she said sharply. "Look at yourself. You're white as a sheet. Your arm is twice its normal size. Your men are watching you stagger around and thinking they have to do the same if they get hurt. Is that what you want? A camp full of stubborn martyrs dropping in their tracks because the boss taught them rest is weakness?" His eyes flared. For a moment, she thought she'd gone too far. No one spoke to him that way. But then his gaze flicked past her, to where two of his men were indeed watching, concern etched on their faces. Something in his expression shifted. He exhaled, a slow, reluctant surrender. "Fine," he muttered. "You win." She blinked. What?" "You win," he repeated. "I'll sit, at least until the doctor gets here." His good hand came up as she moved to support him. "Don't look so shocked. I said we were partners, didn't I? A man who won't listen to his partner's judgment has no business being in charge of anything." The word partner, spoken so matter-of-factly in the midst of disaster, sent a flicker of warmth through her even here, among snow and blood. She stepped to his side, close enough to feel his heat, and guided him toward the nearest intact log pile. His weight leaned into her more than he probably realized. She braced herself, feeling the solidity of him under the tremor. Together, they made it to the logs. He sank down with a hiss between his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "Let me see," she said, already reaching for the torn fabric. "Eleanor," he began. "Don't you dare," she snapped. "I used my given name last night. You don't get to turn formal now to keep me at arm's length." His mouth twitched despite his pain. "Fair enough." She peeled the shirt gently back from the injured shoulder. The flesh beneath was an ugly swirl of purples and blues, swelling already creeping down toward his chest and up into his neck. It was worse than she'd feared. "Did anyone check if it was fully dislocated?" she asked. "One of the men tried to roll it back into place when it happened," he said. "Felt it pop. Then the slide came, no time to see to it proper." "Lucky for you," she said, voice dry to hide her worry. "I paid attention to more than poetry in Boston." She placed her fingers carefully around the joint, feeling for the telltale gap, the wrongness of misaligned bone. He tensed under her touch but didn't pull away. "Breathe," she murmured. He obeyed, the great chest rising and falling. "It's seated," she said at last, relief loosening her shoulders. "But strained badly. You need that arm immobilized completely. No more waving it around giving orders." He snorted. "You'd have me mocked in my own camp." "I'd have you alive to be mocked," she retorted. "Those seem like good odds." Before he could respond, the doctor arrived in a flurry of breath and curses, led by Mary. The older man knelt first by the badly wounded, checking bandages, nodding approval here, issuing corrections there. When he finally straightened and turned toward Magnus, his face was already etched with fatigue. "I've seen you too much this season, Thorne," he grumbled. "You're becoming a bad habit." Magnus's mouth twitched. "Good to see you too, Doctor." Eleanor stepped back, giving the man space, but staying close enough to hear. "Who bound these?" the doctor asked, nodding toward the splints and tourniquets. "The teacher," someone replied. He glanced at Eleanor, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Not bad work," he said. "Keep that up, and you'll put me out of a job." "I assure you, I have no desire to replace you," she said. "One crisis a season is quite enough." He grunted and turned to Magnus's shoulder, prodding, muttering, retying the sling with more care and stern warnings about rest and common sense. Magnus bore it with minimal complaint, though his jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. Through it all, Eleanor hovered at the edge of the circle of men, torn between wanting to help and knowing she'd done what she could. Her hands, stained with another man's blood, trembled slightly. When the worst of the noise had died down, when the dead man's body had been carried away, and the two gravely injured were settled for the long, uncertain night ahead, Magnus pushed himself to his feet again. "Oh, you should be in bed," the doctor said. "So should you," Magnus replied. "Half the town keeps you running, but here we both are." The older man shook his head and stomped off to tend to someone else. Eleanor moved closer. "You need to go down to town," she said quietly. "Rest. Let your men handle the rest of the cleanup. They know what they're doing." He looked at the torn path of the slide, at the battered camp, at the men moving slowly now, exhaustion written in every line. Then he looked at her. "Walk with me," he said. She hesitated. "Magnus." "Just a little way," he said. "If I fall, you can scold me back to my feet." Against her better judgment, she nodded. They walked along the edge of the slide, careful where the snow underfoot was still unstable. The air smelled of wet earth and sap, sharp and raw. Broken trunks jutted from the debris like splintered bones. The mountain loomed above, indifferent. "This is what I fear most," he said suddenly. "Not the cold, not the sores, the mountain shrugging and taking what it will." "You can't control it," she said softly. "No," he agreed, "but I can read it better every year. Mark where not to build, when not to cut. I thought I'd accounted for this gully. I was wrong." He looked at her, something like pain and guilt mixed in his eyes. "A man died today because I misjudged." "You don't know that," she said. "The mountain might have taken more if you hadn't done all your reading and caution. You can't count the lives saved as easily as the ones lost." He stared at the debris. "I've buried enough men to know the weight of each one. It doesn't get lighter. Neither does the weight of each child I could fail," she said quietly. "Each one who might slip through my fingers, untaught, unchanged. I lie awake sometimes, thinking of what more I could have done that day, that week, wondering if I gave enough of myself." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing some mirror of his own burden. "You carry them like I carry my men," he said. "Yes," she admitted. "And like you, I can count the ones I've helped directly. I can't count the ones who might someday avoid a terrible fate because they read a contract properly, or chose a safer path, or remembered a story of courage when they were afraid." She touched his good arm lightly. "You said it yourself once. You work around the stumps or you trip and fall. You can't cut down every tree the mountain throws at you. You can only do your best not to leave unnecessary stumps behind." He huffed an almost laugh. "You're very fond of using my own words against me." "They're good words," she said, emboldened by the faint smile. "Worth repeating." They walked in silence for a time, listening to the drip of meltwater and the distant voices of men rebuilding. "Oh, you ran up here," he said finally, tone shifting. "Didn't you?" She blinked. Yes, more or less. From town. Yes." He shook his head slowly. "When the slide started, my first thought was for my men on the road. My second was for the camp sheds. My third was for the town in case the path ran further than we'd mapped." He paused. "At some point between all that, I thought of you." She swallowed. "Wondering if your wood supply would wash away." He gave her a look. "Wondering if you'd be out on some errand and end up where you shouldn't. Wondering if I'd still be able to find you if the worst happened." Her heart stuttered. "Magnus." He stopped walking. The slide edge lay to their right, the forest to their left. Above them, the sky had gone a soft, bruised grey, clouds gathering again. The air felt charged, like the moments before a storm. He turned to face her fully, his height and breadth blotting out part of the sky. "You stormed into my camp that night with a pot of stew and changed more than my dinner," he said. "You stormed into a board meeting without raising your voice and changed this town's direction. You stormed up here today when any sensible woman would have stayed in the safety of her schoolhouse." "I've never been particularly sensible," she said, but her throat was tight. "I know sensible women," he said. "Respect them. But what I—" He broke off, searching her face. "Eleanor, when I left my uncle's house, I swore I'd never again tie my fate to someone who could be used against me, who could be hurt because of what I do. I told myself I'd live in the cold and quiet and be content with that. Men under my command, trees to fell, ledgers to balance." He lifted his good hand, then let it fall helplessly to his side. "I didn't plan for you." Her breath came shallow and fast. "How you've put warmth back into places I thought were dead," he went on, voice low and rough. "You've stood where others backed down. You've made me consider what this town could be, not just what it is." His eyes burned into hers. "And today, when I saw that slide start, it was like the mountain reached into my chest and squeezed. Not because of the camp, because I realized there's something I could lose now that would hurt more than any land." "Magnus," she whispered. "Don't—" "I need you to hear this," he said. "Before another slide comes, before Pritchard schemes, or my uncle interferes, or you convince yourself you're better off with a man whose hands have never seen a splinter." He took a careful step closer, cutting the distance between them to a few feet. "I care for you," he said simply, "more than is sensible, more than I intended. I've tried to tell myself it's admiration, respect for your determination, gratitude for what you do for my men's children, but it's more than that, and I'm tired of lying to myself." Her heart pounded against her ribs. Her hands trembled at her sides. "I think of you when the camp is quiet," he said. "When I see a book someone's left open, when I hear a child reciting his sums, when I look at the town and imagine what 10 years from now might look like. You're in all those pictures." The words came faster now, as if a dam had broken. "I don't know what I can offer you beyond what you already see. A life on a mountain, work that will never be done, a man with more scars than graces. But whatever I am, it's yours if you want it." The world narrowed to his face, his voice, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. This man who stared down slides and storms without flinching now looked at her as if she held the power to wound him worst of all. She realized with a clarity that stole her breath that in the weeks since she'd arrived, her own heart had been shifting like the mountain under snow. Small movements at first, then larger tremors. Until now, standing here, she understood that staying aloof, keeping herself safe, was no longer an honest option. "I was so sure I'd sworn off men like you," she said, voice shaking. "Men who command rooms, men other people look to. I thought I wanted someone gentle and quiet, someone who would not attract notice. After Boston, I equated notice with danger." He tensed, misinterpretation flickering across his features. "But then I met you," she continued quickly, "and you were all those things and none of them. You command, yes, but you also listen. You let yourself be challenged. You hauled yourself out of a future of law books to build something real, something that feeds families." She took a step closer, bridging more of the distance. "You see me, Magnus, not as a fallen lady to be pitied, not as a conquest to be displayed, as a partner, like you said. That's more than any man in Boston ever offered." He swallowed hard. "Eleanor, I care for you too," she said, the words surprising her only in how long they'd waited to be spoken. "Enough that when I saw that slide, I ran without thinking. Enough that I lie awake at night wondering how I'm supposed to keep my heart in my chest while you live under a mountain that shrugs without warning." The confession felt like stepping off a cliff, yet instead of plummeting, she felt strangely lighter. "I don't know what a life with you would look like," she went on. "I don't know how I'd trade ballrooms for logging camps, or if I'd miss fine china when I'm eating stew in a cabin. I only know that the thought of a life that doesn't have you in it, at least nearby," her voice broke, then steadied, "feels smaller, poorer." She reached up, fingers trembling, and laid her hand lightly on his chest, over his hammering heart. "That frightens me," she admitted, "but not enough to make me turn away." For a heartbeat he didn't move. Then his good hand came up, covering hers, dwarfing it completely. His eyes closed briefly, as if in prayer. When he opened them again, there was a fierce, almost disbelieving joy in them. "I'm not a man given to pretty wording," he said, a rough laugh catching in his throat. "You know that." "I've noticed," she said, her own voice wobbly with half-hysterical relief. "But I swear you this," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "I will never use your past against you. I will never punish you for caring too much. I will likely be stubborn as a mule at times and frighten you with my risks." His mouth twisted. "But I will listen when you tell me to sit down. I will fight for you in those boardrooms the way you fight for my boys in that schoolhouse. And I will never, ever let this mountain or this town convince you you are anything less than the strongest woman I know." Tears blurred her vision. "Those are very pretty words to my ears," she whispered. "Then I'll keep finding them," he said. His thumb brushed the back of her hand in a small, almost hesitant caress. The gesture, in its gentleness, undid her. "May I—" he began, then stopped. "No. You tell me if I may. You've had enough stolen choices for one lifetime." She understood perfectly. Her heart felt as if it might burst through her ribs. "You may," she said, voice barely more than breath, "if you still wish to." He stepped closer, slow and careful, as if afraid a sudden motion might frighten her or topple them both into the slide's path. His hand came up to cradle her cheek, fingers warm despite the cold. She leaned into his touch, eyes drifting closed. When his lips met hers, it was not the fierce, devouring claim of a man conquering. It was a question, asked in the softest language they had. She answered by lifting onto her toes, letting her free hand slide up to rest lightly at the side of his neck. The kiss deepened, not in urgency, but in honesty. There was no ballroom artifice here, no audience to impress. Just the meeting of two people who had walked through different ruins and chosen to build something new from the rubble. The world did not stop. Men still moved in the camp. Snow still melted and refroze. The mountains still loomed, indifferent. But in that small circle of shared warmth, something fundamental shifted. When they broke apart, breath white in the cold air, he rested his forehead lightly against hers. "Well," he said hoarsely, "that's one promise broken." She blinked, dizzy. "What promise?" "The one I made to myself years ago," he said, "about never tying my heart to anything that could be taken from me." "Oh," she said, "I apologize?" He laughed then, a real one, low and warm. "Don't," he said. "Some promises deserve breaking." From the camp a shout drifted. "Boss, doctor says we need more men to move the injured." Duty, like gravity, reasserted itself. He sighed, stepping back a fraction. "I have to go." "I know," she said. She squared her shoulders. "And I have to get back to town. There will be frightened children to reassure." He nodded, gaze lingering on her face. "We've said some big things," he said, "but nothing's settled yet. Not properly. There are practicalities to consider. Where you'd live, how we'd arrange your school, how to keep Pritchard from meddling more than he already does. Practicalities can wait a day," she said. "What matters is that we understand each other now." "We do," he agreed. "More than I ever thought I'd understand another person." He hesitated, then added, "I won't push you. You decide at your own pace what you want from this, from me. But know this, I'm not going anywhere unless the mountain physically drags me off." "And even then," she said, managing a small smile, "you'd likely dig your way back out." "Not without you pulling at the other side," he replied. They parted with a last lingering look that felt like a promise in itself. On her way back down the mountain, escorted by an uncharacteristically quiet James, Eleanor's lips still tingled. Her mind spun with worries about the town's reaction, about Pritchard's inevitable interference, about the vast, wild unknown of a life tied to this man and this mountain. Yet beneath the worries ran a steady undercurrent of something new, not the fragile, glittering hope she'd carried into her first Boston engagement, dependent on fortunes and social whims. This was heavier, harder, like a beam hewn from old timber. She could build on this. In town, children would be told of the slide. Some would cry. Some would boast they'd never be afraid of snow again. Parents would murmur about risk and fate and the price of life on the frontier. And somewhere in all those conversations, the story would spread. The teacher who ran toward danger. The logging boss who trusted her enough to let her see him at his weakest. The way they stood together at the edge of destruction and chose each other anyway. Neither Eleanor nor Magnus heard those stories yet. They only felt, in their separate beds that night, the echo of a kiss given and received. Above them, the mountain lay still for the moment. Snowpack settled, streams finding new paths through thawing earth. Change, once begun, rarely stops. It merely pauses, gathering strength for the next movement. So it would be with them. Winter settled fully on Timber Ridge. the snow thickening like flour over the land. The schoolhouse glowed warm inside, a beacon amid the frozen forest, filled with children's laughter and lessons that stretched from arithmetic to poetry. Eleanor had grown into her role here, not just the teacher, but a pillar in a town that was slowly changing under her influence. Magnus Thorne lived within that change. His once solitary camp was now a center of quiet activity, his men respectful of the woman who could charm stubborn children and tame stubborn men with equal grace. Eleanor found herself visiting often, bringing books, baskets of food, and the small comforts of civilization to the rugged mountain life. Their partnership blossomed into courtship, a delicate dance of shared glances over firelight, hands brushing as they worked together, hushed conversations about hopes and fears. Amid the snow-covered pines, their affection grew, tempered by the realities of their world. But the rich suitors of town had not forgotten Eleanor. Franklin Pritchard had shifted tactics, parading his wealth with extravagant gifts and promises of a comfortable life, in grand houses far from muddy streets and cold winters. At the same time, Charles Waverley spread murmurings, insinuations about Eleanor's past, questioning her motives and loyalty. The town's tranquility was fragile. One evening, at a Christmas gathering in the community hall, Pritchard presented Eleanor with a delicate gold locket, its surface etched with intricate patterns. "For a lady who deserves the finest things," he declared before the assembled crowd. Faces turned, whispers followed. Magnus watched from the shadows, jaw clenched, eyes cold. He stepped forward, voice low but firm. "Eleanor needs no gifts. She has earned her place here with intelligence and courage, not with trinkets." The room fell into uneasy silence. Pritchard forced a smile, but the challenge had been laid bare. Beneath the surface of this social contest, the antagonist, Judge Thorne, fed the growing tension with quiet machinations. He feared losing influence to the mountain giant and the woman who had captivated him. Gathering information on Eleanor's family scandal, he plotted to expose her vulnerabilities and drive a wedge between her and Magnus. Yet, amid the storm of jealousy and ambition, Eleanor and Magnus planned a future, hopeful, uncertain, but fiercely their own. They spoke of winter's end, of spring planting and children's bright futures. Outside, the mountain stood unyielding, witness to the unfolding drama. The cold bitterness of early spring was not confined to the tides and thawing snow. In Timber Ridge, under polite facades and feigned smiles, a scandal unfurled with the force of an avalanche. One morning, a rusted envelope appeared on Eleanor's doorstep, a letter bearing her family's bloodline and past failings, dredged up and laid bare by Judge Thorne's careful orchestration. The community's whispers morphed into pointed accusations, her teaching methods labeled dangerous, her presence questioned. At a hastily convened town meeting, Charles Waverley stepped forward, brandishing forged letters hinting at Eleanor's improper conduct in Boston, implying deceit and instability. The rich suitors seized the moment to reclaim their place, reminding all that Eleanor was an outsider, unworthy of Timber Ridge's trust. Magnus stood shattered. Torn between his duty to his family's legacy and his love for Eleanor, he wavered. The mountain, once solid beneath his feet, felt like shifting ground. Eleanor faced the harshest judgment of all. The community she had come to call home turned cold, and the threat of exile loomed. Alone but unbroken, she made the painful choice to leave Timber Ridge, fearing her presence might tear the fractured town apart. Magnus grappled with his own turmoil, between allegiance and heart. In the silence of his cabin, he wrestled with regret and resolve. Their separation was bitter and unresolved, a wound both shared but could not heal. The mountain watched, indifferent, as Eleanor disappeared into the mist and Magnus buried himself deeper in work and silence. The townspeople were divided. Some mourned, others reveled in their victory. The echoes of love and betrayal lingered long after the snow had melted. Spring arrived with the thaw, melting snow revealing fertile earth and secrets long buried beneath the ice. Timber Ridge stirred from its winter sleep, stubborn and bright as the crocuses pushing through thawed soil, but beneath the surface of renewed life, old wounds festered. Eleanor returned in the early days of May, riding in on a wagon laden with books, provisions, and determination. Rumors of her departure had reached the mountain camp and the valley alike, and while some greeted her with thin smiles, many more offered heartfelt embraces and whispered apologies. Her absence had been a trial for Timber Ridge. Without her steady hand and voice, the school had faltered, leaving children adrift and parents uncertain. Magnus faced his own reckonings, trust betrayals, struggles to contain his enterprise, and the gnawing ache of loss. Yet through it all, the mountain giant had never given up hope that Eleanor would come back. The catalyst was a storm of political and personal revelations. Investigations revealed Judge Thorne's manipulations, forged documents, bribed officials, and calculated slander meant to expel Eleanor and strengthen his own grip on the town. Franklin Pritchard's greed was exposed in ledger audits, showing money funneled from public funds to private accounts. Charles Waverley's complicity in the schemes surfaced through testimonies and intercepted letters. Timber Ridge rallied. Parents, townsfolk, and even some initially skeptical merchants rose in Eleanor's defense. Magnus, once silent, took decisive action, confronting the conspirators in public meetings, demanding restitution and refusing to allow old power to suffocate new growth. The moment of reunion came quietly one afternoon. Eleanor stood at the edge of town, watching children play in sunshine that smelled of pine and promise. A shadow fell beside her. She turned, heart catching at the sight of Magnus, his good arm still in a sling, dirt smudging his work shirt, eyes bright with relief and love. "Welcome home," he said simply. She smiled through tears. Home. Their embrace was the end of a long winter and the beginning of a shared spring, a promise that no mountain, no scheme, no past could keep them apart. Years later, Timber Ridge bore the marks of transformation. The schoolhouse had grown, its walls enlarged, its windows brighter. Children's laughter mingled with the steady rhythm of saws and hammers as new families arrived, drawn by tales of opportunity and community. Eleanor and Magnus built more than a life. They built a legacy. Their marriage was a celebration of resilience, love, and the power of standing together against the odds. They raised children who knew both city learning and mountain strength, who walked the line between tradition and progress. Eleanor's teaching extended beyond the schoolhouse into the broader town. She helped establish a reading circle for adults, promoted literacy among workers, and petitioned for better facilities. Magnus expanded his timber business responsibly, balancing industry and conservation with the wisdom born of deep care for the land. The people of Timber Ridge, once wary and fractured, became a community bound by respect and hope. The echoes of the past remained, but they did not dictate the future. Instead, stories of the city girl who chose the giant lumberjack, not the suitors of wealth and ease, were told around fires and at gatherings, inspiring new generations. In the twilight of their years, Eleanor and Magnus sat on the porch of their mountain home, watching grandchildren chase sunlight through the forest. The mountain's shadow stretched long and gentle, a guardian of all they had built. Eleanor's hand found Magnus's, strong and steady. "We carved a life from the mountains," she said softly. "Together," he replied. And as the evening sky blazed with stars, their hearts beat in quiet harmony, sealed by the journey that had brought them from strangers to soulmates, from exile to home, from broken pasts to a shared, enduring legacy.